In this third part of the lecture, we'll be looking at the diagnosis and prevalence of generalized joint hypermobility and HEDS, as these are disorders that are most commonly seen in the dance environment. We'll also be looking at further complications within these disorders that are now appearing in the literature. Finally, we'll discuss the implications of generalized joint hypermobility and HEDS in the dance environment. So let's now have a look at how we might recognise generalised joint hypermobility. In order to do this, there are major criteria and a 9-point score which is known as the Baton score. This includes flexion of the fifth finger, the apposition of the thumb towards the forearm, passively hyperextended elbow beyond 10 degrees, a passively hyperextended knee beyond 10 degrees, and the ability to actively place the hands on the floor without bending the knees. 1 point is scored for each side of the body in 1 to 4, and 1 point is scored for number 5, making a maximum of 9. The criteria for diagnosing generalized joint hypermobility and the cutoff point is generally used at anything more than 4. So anyone that scores more than 4 in this criteria is diagnosed as having generalized joint hypermobility. This cutoff point does change when we're looking at younger children, for example, because they tend to be more flexible naturally. Now let's have a look at photographs of these testing points. Here we see the flexible little finger, the hyperflexible thumb, the hyperflexible elbows and knees, and finally the palms on the floor test. Now one might suggest that this is not realistic in dance, because every dancer, as we know, strives to make this position and could have this point through acquired flexibility and not through a heritable status. Recognising HEDS, however, is more complex and uses the Brighton score. There are a range of symptoms that need proper clinical diagnosis in order to determine HEDS, and therefore this should not be attempted by dance teachers. Generalized joint hypermobility, therefore, is classed when a Baton score of 4 or more is achieved. Generalized joint hypermobility plus symptoms from the Brighton score mean that an individual has hypermobile type Ehlers-Danlos syndrome. We know that generalized joint hypermobility can be advantageous in dance because of its extra range of motion. However, dancers who have joint hypermobility often also present with a range of additional symptoms that manifest in a variance and degree, and these include delayed tissue healing, poor proprioception, arthralgia, back pain, spondylolysis and spondylolithiasis, soft tissue lesions and scars, rheumatism, subluxation or dislocation of the joints, joint pain following physical activity for no unknown reason, chronic fatigue, poor pain thresholds and disordered sleeping and anxiety traits, and rapid deconditioning following a period of rest from exercise, and this is also common in the hypermobile dancer and athlete. So let's now consider generalized joint hypermobility from a dance practitioner perspective. Generalized joint hypermobility is often regarded as an asset in the classical ballet dancer, as it facilitates the advantage of naturally extreme range of motion in the joints that the aesthetics of classical ballet demand. Generalized joint hypermobility presents chronologically more severely in children and young adolescents. Anecdotally, this is a critical period in both the lifespan development and the onset of intense training for the young dancer. Generalized joint hypermobility also reduces with age. The reason for this is maturation and the associated loss of flexibility in the connective tissue. The extreme range of motion prevails in males until they are around 30 and in females until they are around 50, and this would have implications for the mature dancer. Now let's also look at the prevalence of generalized joint hypermobility in dance and sport. Schmidt et al. Report generalized joint hypermobility in young athletes and dancers across a range of cutoff points. They used a Bayton score of more than 4 to determine the highest prevalence of generalized joint hypermobility in ballet dancers, with gymnastics coming second and handball players coming third. The prevalence ranking remains the same when cut-offs of more than 5 and more than 6 were also applied. The prevalence of generalized joint hypermobility in professional ballet is reported as high as 89 to 90%, which is over 4 times the general average reported by Young et al. In 2019. Clearly from these figures we can see that generalized joint hypermobility is sought after within dance. Professor Rodney Graham, a professor of rheumatology and one of the first people to do substantial research around hypermobility, coined it as the Beauty and the Beast syndrome, recognizing that yes, it was an asset because of the flexibility it brought with it, but also it was a liability because of the fragile tissue and potential injury. Unquestionably, generalized joint hypermobility enables extreme ranges of motion, allowing dancers to effortlessly lift their legs, contort their spines in all directions, and hyperextend ankles to meet a desired and often required aesthetic. See for example modern choreographic works such as Duo by Forsyth and Push by Milifanti. Controversially, industry demands influence dance students in training as they struggle to emulate seasoned professionals such as Gilliam, who you see here, who undeniably carries the genetic signature of generalized joint hypermobility. So far, we've looked at the physical or the biological side of generalized joint hypermobility. There is, however, an interplay of body and brain in hypermobility that is now manifesting in the literature. Joint hypermobility is reported as having an overrepresentation in people with anxiety, mood, and neurodevelopmental disorders. The constitutional differences in the control of the body state in hypermobility are also now considered as significant contributing mechanisms to anxiety. And the meta-analysis of both healthy and clinical populations that present with hypermobility further demonstrates that these people experience anxiety, panic, agoraphobia, and depressive disorders. Interestingly, a group of researchers in France, in a psychiatric clinic, noticed a commonality between their patients whereby generalized joint hypermobility connected the patients with other clinical disorders. These included anxiety states and panic attacks, heightened interoception, which is a sense of the inside of the body as opposed to the body in space, psychopathological obsessive compulsive disorders, anxiety disorders and depression, ADHD, autism spectrum disorders, a lack of efficacy of local anesthetics, pain enhancement, anxiety states and panic attacks. This work has now led us to a better understanding of the hypermobility spectrum disorders, and we can see that joint hypermobility, including localized joint hypermobility, generalized joint hypermobility, Peripheral joint hypermobility and historical joint hypermobility are the top of the iceberg, and they intersect as heritable connective tissue disorders with other disorders such as Marfan syndrome, osteogenesis imperfecta, and the Ehlers-Danlos syndromes, which includes hypermobility type Ehlers-Danlos syndrome. All of these syndromes present with a fragility of tissues, a propensity for trauma, and instability. They may include gastrointestinal disorders, psychopathological compulsive disorders, anxiety disorders and depression, and impaired proprioception problems with balance and coordination and posture, alongside dysautonomia, potentially ADHD, and autism spectrum disorders. And whilst we won't see all of these in the dance studio, what we do need to be mindful of is there may be something underlying the joint hypermobility that we're not aware of. So in the real world, as dance practitioners, we know that hypermobile syndrome disorders enable extreme ranges of motion in the joints that are required for dance. Joint hypermobility and children within the dance studio bring their own problems and may present itself as clumsiness, which is unexpected, or motor delay development. Indeed, these might be the reasons why a young child is sent to the dance class in the first place. Joint hypermobility syndromes can also present as dyspraxia, unexplained pain in the legs after exercise, and general sprains. These are things that the dance practitioner needs to take into consideration when they're looking at the dancers they have in their classroom. And the unexplainable pain in the legs after exercise may be considered as some dance teachers as a sign of weakness, when actually it's a sign of a syndrome and a genetic condition. Joint hypermobility syndromes also present problems when we look at injury. We know that generalized joint hypermobility comes with a fragility and potentially injury, if not looked after carefully. When a hypermobile dancer becomes injured, they have unstable joints, which may cause increased pain, and we know that generalized joint hypermobility also presents itself as an overrepresentation of pain, which will then lead to inactivity in the dancer and further deconditioning and lack of proprioception. So it is very important as a dance practitioner that we understand the complexity of generalized joint hypermobility and try to strengthen our dancers and avoid injury at all times. And now I'd like for you to stop a moment and consider the asset liability debate that is prominent in the literature around generalized joint hypermobility and dance, and also consider Rodney Graham's Beauty and Beast syndrome. What I would like to propose is that actually dance is an asset for generalized joint hypermobility and can be the beauty that tames the beast of the syndrome. Dance can train proprioception, it can train the mind-body connection, and when carefully and safely trained, it is probably the best thing that a person with generalized joint hypermobility can do in terms of physical activity, because it is gentle and controlled and is not necessarily extreme. And now I would like to leave you with a quotation from one of my participants from my own research. This quote came from a dancer who was hypermobile, had hypermobile type Ehlers-Danlos syndromes. They knew they had this syndrome when they were training, and their training was modified carefully, and it enabled them to have a very successful career. The dancer says, "My hypermobility enabled me to get lots of dance jobs that I might have otherwise not had, and I could afford to have a great life in Europe. On another practical level, I can still bend down and pick something up off the floor with not much effort. I can even pick things up with my feet." I'd like to thank you all for taking time to listen to the lecture, and on the following slides you will find some indicative bibliography that you might want to follow up and read about if you've been inspired by the subject.